Before we start, I want to encourage you to have a set of the sermon notes. If you'll go to the link right down below the video, you'll be able to print a set of the sermon notes. I also want to encourage you to have some communion elements. You'll want to have some bread or a cracker, you'll want to have some juice or some wine. If you don't have juice or wine, anything to drink would work. But you'll want to have those communion elements because here in about 20 minutes when we get to the end of the sermon, we'll move right into a time of communion with you. So, if you need any of those things, I would encourage you to pause the video right now, grab whatever you need once everything is ready, then go ahead and resume the playback. So, I'm about to make a statement that not necessarily everyone is going to agree with, but I think that most people would say that we are in a pretty good place in the year 2024 with modern medicine. Now, there's obviously a great deal more that modern medicine needs to be able to do. Obviously, our medical system, particularly here in the United States, it has problems. But at the same time, when you compare where we are today with modern medicine to where we were 100 years ago, or where they were 1,000 years ago, or where they were in biblical times, it feels like we have made light years worth of advances. Over the course of the 54 years I've been on this planet, I feel like medicine has taken pretty good care of me. I don't have a lot of complaints. Now again, I know that there are people that do have complaints about the way that modern medicine has influenced their lives. And please know that I'm very sympathetic to that. I completely understand and I would never diminish that. But I feel very fortunate that modern medicine has taken care of me over the course of my life. And I would also share with you that our oldest son, and I've talked about this before, but when he was born back in 2003, he was born with some pretty serious medical issues. And over the course of the first 4 or 5 years of his life, thankfully, they were able to address all of those medical issues through a series of surgeries. By the time he was 4 or 5 years old, we ultimately crossed a finish line to the point where he was fine after that, never had to have any more medical interventions. If you saw our oldest son today, you would never know that there was anything wrong with him. But the first 4 or 5 years of his life, it was pretty harrowing at times. It was touch and go at times. And I would also add that if our oldest son had been born just 100 years ago, if he had been born in 1903 as opposed to 2003, I'm pretty confident in saying, and I think my wife would say the same thing, he probably would not have lived to be a week old. And so I certainly feel like, and I feel like my wife would say the same, that modern medicine has taken pretty good care of our oldest son as well. Again, is it perfect? No. But do I feel like all in all we're pretty fortunate with modern medicine? Yes, that is certainly how I feel. And I know there are exceptions, and I hope that you, as you watch this, that you haven't experienced any of those exceptions. And if you have, please know that I am certainly sensitive and respectful of that. But the reason that I bring that up is because, again, when you compare where we are today to where we were 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, it feels like we have come so far, it's incredible. And the reason that I'm bringing that up is because in the passage we're going to be taking a look at today, the lectionary gospel reading for June 23rd of 2024, there is going to be a woman in this passage that the medicine that they had 2,000 years ago had caused her nothing but problems. So, without any further ado, let's take a look at that lectionary gospel reading. This is Mark chapter 5, verses 21 through 43, and it is the passage in its entirety. When Jesus had again crossed over by boat to the other side of the lake, a large crowd gathered around him while he was by the lake. Then one of the synagogue leaders named Jairus came, and when he saw Jesus, Jairus fell at Jesus' feet. Jairus pleaded earnestly with Jesus, "My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live." So Jesus went with Jairus. A large crowd followed and pressed around him, and a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had. Yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak because she thought, if I just touch his clothes, I will be healed. Immediately, her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. At once, Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. He turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" "You see the people crowding up against you," his disciples answered, "and yet you can ask, 'Who touched me?'" But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at Jesus' feet, and trembling with fear, she told Jesus the whole truth. Jesus said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." While Jesus was still speaking, some people came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue leader. "Your daughter is dead," they said. "Why bother the teacher anymore?" Overhearing what they said, Jesus told Jairus, "Don't be afraid, just believe." He did not let anyone follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the home of the synagogue leader, Jesus saw a commotion with people crying and wailing loudly. Jesus went in and said to them, "Why all this commotion and wailing? The child is not dead, but asleep." But they laughed at Jesus. After he put them all out, Jesus took the child's father and mother and the disciples who were with him and went in where the child was. Jesus took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha cum," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, get up." And immediately the girl stood up and began to walk around. She was 12 years old. At this, they were completely astonished. Jesus gave strict orders not to let anyone know about this and told them to give her something to eat. May God bless the reading of the powerful and the profound and the inspiring word. So this is, as far as I'm concerned, an incredible passage. And hopefully I don't sound glib when I say this, but this is a passage in which it feels like we get two miracles for the price of one. So what I'd like to do is what we always do. I'd like for us to go ahead and talk through the passage, make sure that we are tracking with everything that's happening in this passage. I know it's a long passage. And then what I want to do after that is I want us to talk about what we should do. You and I, we are people of faith, and what we want to do at all times is we want to act in faith. In this passage, we have a couple of examples of a man named Jairus and then an unnamed woman who both act in faith in this passage. And there are some examples, or there are some lessons that we can take away from them in this passage. So, let's talk through the passage first. At the start of the passage, it tells us that Jesus has just crossed over, actually from the east side of the Sea of Galilee. Now he's back on the west side of the Sea of Galilee. And as soon as he lands, there is a synagogue leader that comes to Jesus. His name is Jairus. Now, this is rather remarkable because one of the things that tells us about Jairus is that he wasn't just a run-of-the-mill person. As a synagogue leader, he would have been considered one of the Hebrew religious leaders. And at this point in Jesus' ministry, most of the Hebrew religious leaders were not fans of Jesus. They, for the most part, thought that Jesus was a heretic. They thought that Jesus was misguided at best. And so the fact that one of the Jewish religious leaders has gone to Jesus and has asked for help, well, that's probably not something that the other religious leaders would have thought looked great. And so nevertheless, Jairus is incredibly worried about his daughter, whether or not she's going to live, and so he does exactly that. And Jesus agrees to go with Jairus to see his daughter. Now, as they are making their way to go see Jairus' daughter, there's a crowd that has developed around them. And it tells us that there was a woman who has had this medical issue for a dozen years. It tells us that she's been going to doctor after doctor after doctor, that she has spent her entire life savings trying to find a doctor who could help her with her medical issue, but sadly, tragically, the doctors haven't made it better, they've just made it worse. And so, at this point, she thinks to herself, look, I've heard about this Jesus. I've heard that he may be the Messiah, that he may be the Son of God, that there may be a miracle that he could perform for me. And I don't even have to probably talk to him. Probably all I have to do is just go and just touch the edge of his clothing, and maybe I'll be healed. And so that's exactly what she does. And you know what? It worked. She works her way into the crowd. She manages just to touch the edge of Jesus' clothing, and she is healed. Now, I think that Jesus' response here is probably a little bit for the benefit of the people who were already there. Because did Jesus probably know what had happened? I think so. I think in Jesus' divine nature, he knew exactly what had happened. But at the same time, this is an incredible miracle, and he wants everyone to know about it. And so Jesus says, what just happened? Some power has gone out from me. And so the disciples, who are being snarky or they're being sarcastic, they say, well, Jesus, you're surrounded by a crowd right now. Of course people touched you. He touched you, and he touched you. She touched you. He touched you. She touched you. Everybody's been touching you, Jesus. You're in the middle of a crowd. But Jesus says, no, I know what just happened. Someone needs to fess up. And so the woman, to her credit, she steps forward and she tells Jesus that she is the one who just wanted to touch just the edge of his clothing in the hope that she would be healed. And I love Jesus' response to her in this passage, because here in Mark 5:34, he says to her daughter, your faith has healed you. Your faith has healed you. Go in peace, be freed from your suffering. And hopefully that was the happy ending for this woman. But at this point in the story, the original story, as far as Jairus wanting Jesus to come and to heal his daughter, it seems like all of a sudden now we've got a sad ending to the story, because some people have come now to tell Jairus, your daughter has passed away. And they say to Jairus, just let this rabbi go, because your daughter is no longer living. And I love Jesus' response to Jairus in that moment. Jesus' response to Jairus in that moment is, don't be afraid. Don't worry. Just believe. And so Jesus continues on. Now at this point, he takes just the inner circle of the disciples with him. He doesn't take all 12. He doesn't take all of their hangers-on. He just takes Peter, James, and John. And there's a number of places in the Gospels where Jesus does a number of things with just that inner circle, with Peter, James, and John. So they go to the home of Jairus, and at this point, there are mourners present. And it tells us that they are wailing loudly. Now, there's something that they did back in biblical times that does not make any sense to us. And so I'm just going to tell you what it was, because I think that it actually helps to explain what we're told in verse 40. Because what happens in verse 40 doesn't make any sense either. So let's start with the fact that in biblical times, if you were a person who had money and if you were a person who was influential, one of the things that you could do, and it certainly appears had been done even while Jairus was gone, is that you could hire professional mourners. And I know that seems crazy to us. We would never even consider hiring professional mourners in this day and age, but they did that back in biblical times. So you've got these people that are here that are being paid to put on a show of mourning for the death of this little girl. And so when Jesus shows up and Jesus says, hey, why are you wailing? Why are you crying? The little girl isn't dead. She's just asleep. That probably explains why at least some of the people there laughed at Jesus. Because if, God forbid, it was my child or your child that had passed away and someone showed up and said, don't worry, it's going to be fine, she's just asleep, I would say, oh, please, let that be true. I wouldn't laugh, but if you are a professional mourner and you don't have any emotional investment in the passing of this child, any real emotional investment in the passing of this child, then maybe that would be your reaction. Maybe you would just laugh at what you consider to be a ridiculous statement. Regardless, Jesus says, get out of here, everybody, go, be gone. And so at this point, Jesus takes Jairus and his wife, takes Peter, James, and John, and they go in, and Jesus grabs the hand of this little girl. Now, I should have mentioned this earlier, And what I want to point out to you about Jesus grabbing the hand of this little girl, let's come back to what I missed earlier just in a moment. But if Jesus hadn't been able to raise this little girl from the dead, then he was putting himself in a bad spot by taking her by the hand. I think that's why the passage tells us specifically that he took her by the hand. Because if you touched, in biblical times, if you touched a dead body, then you were considered to be unclean for a week. And so if Jesus, obviously there's no doubt in his mind, but if there had been any doubt in his mind that he could raise this girl from the dead, then he never would have touched her, because now he would be unclean. But because he knew that he could raise her from the dead, he didn't hesitate to take her by the hand and say to her, Talitha cum, which is Aramaic, which is something else I want to come back to in just a minute. I've got two tangents I want to go off on. So let me go back to the original tangent. So I just talked about this idea that touching a dead body, that would make you unclean. Now, the other thing that I forgot to mention earlier is that this woman who has had this medical issue for 12 years, one of the things that was so difficult about that for her is that this medical issue that she had made her unclean as far as that culture was concerned 2,000 years ago. And so as far as that culture was concerned 2,000 years ago, this woman with this medical issue was considered untouchable. I mean, for all intents and purposes, they treated her as if she had leprosy 2,000 years ago. So that is why it's such a huge deal, a massive, huge deal, that Jesus was able to heal her. I'm sorry, I forgot to mention that earlier. But the same thing here, Jesus touches a dead body. If she's truly dead, then he's unclean, except once Jesus touches her, she is no longer dead. Jesus raises her from the dead. And the other thing, I told you I had two tangents. The other tangent that I wanted to go on very quickly before I start running out of time here is I want to point out to you that in this passage, when Jesus says to her, Talitha cum, you might have noticed that those words, first of all, aren't English words. Second of all, that they are italicized. That's because these are Aramaic words. And the thing is that the New Testament was written in the Greek language, not in Aramaic. And so this is interesting because there are about 8 places in the New Testament where, even though the New Testament is written in Greek, there are about 8 places where Mark and several of the other New Testament authors, for whatever reason, thought, you know what, I'm just going to put the original Aramaic words in there. And this is one of those 8 or so places. And very quickly, I would point out to you, and I know that I'm way off on a tangent now, but I would point out to you that you and I, that we speak English. I don't know if you speak a second language. I can just kind of barely sort of struggle through a conversation in Spanish, but I am by no means bilingual. I mean, I can struggle through a rough conversation in Spanish, but that's it. I would point out to you that everybody who would have lived in this area 2,000 years ago, that they would have had at least 2 languages that they were fluent in, because they would speak in Aramaic, but they would write in Greek. Not only would they have those 2 languages of Greek and Aramaic that they knew because they spoke in Aramaic, they wrote in Greek, but most of these Jewish people also were familiar with Hebrew as well. So most of the people that we're talking about in the New Testament weren't just bilingual, they were trilingual. And then there's us in the year 2024, where I'm not sure if I'm even that great in English, much less Spanish. So anyway, all of that aside, what I want to do now is very quickly, because I am quickly running out of time, is I want to talk about the 3 lessons that we should take away from this passage. In this passage, we have 2 people acting in faith. We have Jairus acting in faith, we have the woman who is acting in faith, and you and I are also acting in faith as we go through our everyday lives. So, 3 quick lessons before the video cuts me off. And the first lesson is this: acting in faith might mean that we ignore religious pressure at times. Acting in faith might mean that we ignore religious pressure at times. I know you're thinking to yourself, Pastor Kerry, what on earth are you talking about right now? What I'm talking about is the fact that in this passage, that Jairus' fellow religious leaders, I guarantee you that they did not like the fact that Jairus went to Jesus when, as far as they were concerned, Jesus was misguided at best, and a lot of them considered him to be a heretic. And so Jairus was ignoring that pressure from his fellow religious leaders. And I believe that there are times in our lives when maybe we will find ourselves in a situation where we need to ignore the pressure that we receive from quote-unquote religious people as well. Another example I would give you is about 500 years ago, there was a man by the name of Martin Luther who felt like things were way out of line in the Catholic Church. And so he ultimately founded the religion that many of us are a part of today, known under the umbrella of Protestantism. And whether you are Baptist or Methodist or Lutheran or the list goes on, there are many, many, many of us, hundreds of millions, if not billions of us, who are considered Protestants, and we owe that to Martin Luther because he ignored the religious pressure that was on him. There's a lot more I could say about this, but I want to just leave it at that. So that is the first lesson. The second lesson is this: acting in faith might mean that we seem irrational at times. Acting in faith might mean that we seem irrational at times. And in this passage, this woman, if she had told her friends or if she had told her family, you know what, I've heard that Jesus is going by, I'm just going to go and try to touch just the edge of his clothing. What do you think her family would have said to her? What do you think her friends would have said to her? They probably would have said to her, that's crazy, that's never going to work. And yet, it did. And Jesus said to her, your faith has healed you, because she had that faith. And friends, there are times in our lives where whatever we do in faith, it might seem irrational, it might seem crazy to people. But we know that God is leading us to do something, and so we need to do it. That is the second lesson we should take away from this passage. The final lesson is this: acting in faith might mean that we hold on to hope against all hope at times. We hold on to hope against all hope at times. In this passage, Jesus said to Jairus, don't be afraid, just believe. And in that moment, Jairus didn't say, no, she's dead, Jesus, you can leave. Jairus chose to hold on to hope. And that's what we do. As believers, as disciples, we are children of hope. And the video is going to cut me off here in about 40 seconds. So what I want to do is I want to invite you to go ahead and grab your communion elements. I'm going to go ahead and grab mine right now. I'm going to go ahead and start communion before the video cuts me off, and then you are welcome to continue communion after the video cuts out. But I want to invite you to partake with me at this time. The body of Christ, broken for us, we partake in remembrance of him. And the blood of Christ, shed for us, we drink in remembrance of him.